Elias Ward had survived 4 years of deep space assignments, a reactor meltdown that nearly took out 3 decks, and 18 straight months sleeping, 6 feet away from a guy who snored like a garbage compactor stuck on full blast. By any reasonable standard, he was a man who could hold himself together under pressure. The universe was about to teach him what pressure actually looked like. It didn't kick off with some dramatic explosion or a tense standoff or a moment wrapped in cosmic significance. It started at a dinner table, in a room full of people pretending they weren't terrified, and one spectacularly wrong comment that Elias would spend the rest of his life either defending or cringing over, depending entirely on what kind of day it was. He worked as a systems engineer aboard the Terran vessel Argus, a mid-range exploration ship that had been traveling for the better part of 8 months just to reach the outer edge of Tari space. The Tari Dominion was not the kind of civilization that handed out casual invitations. They were ancient, hyper-advanced, and had kept a careful and deliberate distance from humanity ever since first contact was established. Not hostile, just extremely selective about who they allowed anywhere near their territory. The Argus was the first human ship they had ever invited through. Every single person on board understood the weight of that. The briefings hammered it home. The ambassador laid it out even clearer. Every hallway conversation, every meal, every quiet moment spent staring out at the stars carried that same pressure underneath it. This mission mattered. The kind of mattered that echoes forward through generations. The kind that historians pull all-nighters writing about. Elias got it. He genuinely did. He just wasn't particularly good at silence. In his experience, silence had a way of turning a room into a pressure cooker, and the best tool he'd ever found for releasing that kind of pressure was the right word at the right moment or occasionally. A very wrong word, at a very wrong moment. That second option was about to become extremely relevant. The formal dinner was held in the main hall of the Argus, a long, pale room the crew had spent 2 full days polishing to an almost aggressive shine. The overhead lighting was sharp and flat, bouncing hard off silver walls and making the whole space feel like the inside of an official document, structured, deliberate, designed to remind everyone in it that this was serious. 7 Tari sat across the table from the human delegation, and they were striking enough to make it genuinely difficult not to stare. Their skin carried a soft metallic sheen, something between silver and pale gold, depending on how the light caught it. Their eyes were nearly colorless, crystalline, the kind of eyes that seemed to absorb everything and give absolutely nothing back. Every movement they made was precisely calibrated, nothing hurried, nothing wasted, every gesture landing with the quiet authority of something that had been thought through well before it was executed. Commander Sarai held the center seat of the Tari delegation. Elias had read her file. Everybody on the ship had read her file. She was the Dominion's most senior diplomatic commander, which meant she was, in roughly equal measure, a military officer, a negotiator, and a living embodiment of everything the Tari held sacred. Control, precision, and the total supremacy of logic over feeling. Her uniform was deep charcoal threaded through with fine silver, and it sat on her like it had been personally designed to remind everyone in the room exactly who they were dealing with. Her eyes, a shade of blue that edged into violet, moved around the space with that steady, all-absorbing attention that made you feel like she was filing you away somewhere permanent. The Tari didn't smile. That was established fact. They considered visible emotional expression and indulgence a symptom of undisciplined thinking. Humor, specifically, struck them as something between an amusing curiosity and a mild character flaw. They weren't rude about it. They were simply puzzled by it, the way a perfectly reasonable person might be puzzled by an otherwise sensible friend who insists on putting their shoes on the wrong feet. Ambassador Rohr delivered his opening address, carefully worded, gracious, formal. He talked about peace and mutual understanding and the significance of this historic meeting. The Tari listened with the absolute stillness of people who had decided that movement was optional, blinking at intervals that felt timed to a calendar. Then their lead officer delivered a response of equal length, equal formality, and somehow even less emotional texture than the silence that had surrounded it. By the time food was actually served, the air in the room had reached that particular density you only find in meetings where nobody is saying what they're actually thinking. Elias sat near the far end of the table and pushed his food around his plate. He watched Commander Sarai work through her meal with the same precision she applied to everything else, each piece cut to identical dimensions. Each movement a small, contained statement of total control. She was the most composed person he had ever shared a table with, and something about that composure made him want to find the edge of it. Se looked up. Their eyes connected across the length of the table. Elias did what he always did when he got caught staring at something he probably shouldn't be staring at. He smiled. Not a diplomatic smile. Not some careful social performance calibrated for the occasion. Just the reflexive, slightly sheepish grin of someone who'd been caught in the act and decided leaning in was better than backing away. And then, because his mouth had always been running a few seconds ahead of his better judgment, he said the thing. You'd be a perfect wife. The room stopped. Not fell silent. Stopped. Every sound, every movement, every half-completed breath suspended simultaneously, like someone had hit pause on the whole universe and then walked away and forgotten about it. The human side of the table froze in collective, visceral horror. The ambassador's fork stayed suspended in midair and didn't come down. Two officers near the middle of the table exchanged the kind of look that only happens when people desperately need someone to confirm they misheard something. Across the table, the entire Tari delegation went completely still. Commander Saray's hand held motionless in space, her fork frozen at shoulder height. Something passed across her face, moving too fast and too controlled to name, and the faint, luminescent quality of her skin rippled briefly. The way a candle flame flickers when air moves across it from a direction you can't quite identify. 3 seconds of absolute, crushing silence. Then the Tari officers began speaking quietly to each other in low, rhythmic tones, their language smooth and layered, moving far too quickly for the room's translation system to keep up with. Sarai turned and looked directly at Elias. Her violet blue eyes were perfectly steady. The hum of the ventilation system was the only thing with any life left in the room. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and completely unhurried. I agree. Elias blinked. Under normal circumstances, he wasn't a man who lost the thread. He had an engineering degree, a pilot's license, and the kind of practical intelligence that came from years of solving critical problems in environments that were actively trying to kill him. Processing incoming information quickly wasn't a preference, it was a professional requirement. And still, sorry, what? Sarai set her fork down with the same deliberate care she used for everything, then folded her hands on the table in front of her. You have made a proposal, she said. Her tone was the same she might use to describe current atmospheric conditions. I have accepted it. The ambassador made a sound that didn't belong to any known language. Elias turned toward him. Ambassador Rar's face had achieved the specific color of a man whose body was attempting a full crisis while his professional training demanded he maintain composure, a conflict that neither side was winning. Elias leaned slightly in his direction and kept his voice low. I was joking, Roar murmured back through lips that were barely moving. She doesn't appear to know that. The hours that followed were the most disorganized of Elias Ward's entire life, and he said this with real authority, given that he had once been on a ship when 3 separate critical systems failed within 4 minutes of each other. This was worse. Messages flew between the Argus and the Tari fleet at a pace that made clear everyone involved was deeply, comprehensively unhappy. The translation team ran their data over and over, searching for errors that simply weren't there. The diplomatic staff crammed themselves into the conference room and had the kind of argument that only happens when intelligent, experienced people are confronted with a problem that has no clean solution. The senior officers gathered in the hallway and argued at a slightly reduced volume. The junior crew collected in the mess hall and whispered. The core issue, once the translators confirmed there had been no translation error whatsoever, was this: among the Tari, a spoken offer of partnership delivered directly, face-to-face. Accepted Alud was a legally binding commitment recognized by Tari law and the Dominion Council. It wasn't a casual turn of phrase. It didn't exist somewhere on a spectrum of social niceties. The words Elias had used, rendered into Tari by the translation system, landed with the precise legal weight and cultural meaning of a formal proposal. Withdrawing it would be considered a significant act of dishonor. Elias sat alone in his quarters with both hands covering his face and replayed the dinner in his head approximately 14 times. You'd be a perfect wife. 5 words. 1 reflex. He had said things more regrettable than that in his actual sleep. The door chimed. Answered Italiano. Sarai stood in the corridor, alone, perfectly composed, expression carrying its usual stillness. Still in full uniform. Of course she was. You appear distressed, Elias Ward, she said. He stepped aside to let her enter because there wasn't a reasonable alternative. Commander, I owe you a direct explanation. What I said at dinner wasn't a real proposal. It wasn't intended as one. Among humans, sometimes we say things like that to put someone at ease, to cut the tension in a difficult situation. It's called humor. It doesn't carry literal meaning. She stepped inside and moved toward the viewport, then turned to study him with that patient, absorbing attention. Humor, she said, a statement offered without literal intent, designed to create connection. More or less, a pause. I don't understand the purpose of offering affection that isn't genuine. Among my people, words of union are never spoken without full weight behind them. When you spoke as you did, I understood it to mean you had observed something in me worthy of partnership. Another pause, and her voice carried something underneath it, steady on the surface, but unmistakably present. That is why I accepted. Elias looked at her. He had expected irritation, or offense, or the kind of cool diplomatic neutrality that people use to manage uncomfortable situations. What he heard instead was something quieter and considerably more real than any of that. I wasn't trying to disrespect you, he said. That was honestly the last thing on my mind. I know, she said. You offered what you believed was warmth, even without understanding its meaning in our language. Most humans who come before the Tari calibrate every single word before they speak it. You did not. She let a moment pass. You spoke from instinct. He wasn't entirely sure that was a compliment. It felt like it might be both a compliment and a gently delivered assessment of his general approach to life. I'm not great at formal situations, he said. I noticed. And there was something right at the very edge of those two words. The faintest trace of dry warmth. Precise and brief, like a single match struck in a dark room. She moved toward the door. Don't carry this worry, Elias Ward. I will speak with the council. Your people will not be held accountable for a misunderstanding on your part. She paused at the doorframe. Rest well. Tomorrow will require a clear head. She was gone before he could respond. Elias stood in the middle of his quarters and looked at the closed door for a long time. The strangest part wasn't the chaos. The strangest part was what he'd seen in her when she spoke, something carefully held back, present but controlled, like light visible through the gap under a closed door. He said quietly, to no one in particular. What did I just do? Morning didn't improve the overall situation. 2 security officers were stationed outside his quarters before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. Ambassador Rohr wanted him in the council room. Immediately. The room was divided along clean, deliberate lines. Human delegation on one side, Tari delegation on the other, with a silence between them that functioned like a physical object. Rohr looked like a man who hadn't slept and had made his peace with the fact that he probably never would again. Sarai stood across from him, composed and completely still. As though the previous evening had been a minor administrative inconvenience she'd already filed and moved past. Elias, Rohr said, the steadiness in his voice clearly costing him something. Tell me you understand what's happened here. I do, sir. Completely. And I take full responsibility. I had no idea those words would carry that meaning in Tari culture. The words were spoken, Sarai said quietly. The acceptance was given. The exchange has been recorded by the Dominion Council. Under our law, this is not something that can simply be dissolved with an explanation. Rohr pressed 2 fingers against his temple. Commander, I want to be respectful here, but in human social context, what he said was casual. Throwaway. It carried no weight and no intent. Sarai tilted her head, a small, precise movement that Elias was starting to read as her version of a raised eyebrow. If your people regularly speak words they don't mean, how does trust function among you? It's not about deception. Rohr paused, regrouping. It's a social mechanism, a way of releasing tension in a room. Elias stepped forward before Rohr could continue. Commander, I wanted to make you smile. That was it. There was no deception involved. I promise you. That. She held his gaze for a long moment. Your intent was not harmful. That is apparent. A breath. But the commitment was made before witnesses and acknowledged by my people. It cannot be erased. The humans exchanged a careful look. So what's the path forward? Roar asked. There is one, Sarai said. Under Tari law, a disputed bond may be submitted to a bonding trial, a ritual evaluation designed to determine whether the words spoken carried genuine truth behind them. If no real connection exists, the bond dissolves cleanly. Neither party carries dishonor. Roar leaned back slightly. And if Elias participates in the trial, and it confirms this was a mistake, everything is resolved. Provided the outcome is as anticipated, Sarai said, yes. Roar turned to Elias with the look of a man handing over the only door available in a room with no windows. Elias looked at Sarai. She held his eyes without wavering. Choices reveal character, she said. They always have. He let out a slow breath. All right, Commander. If the trial is what fixes this, then I'll do it. 3 days later, the Argus arrived at the Tari homeworld. Elias had seen a lot in his years of service. Orbital rings the size of small moons. Asteroid cities carved hollow from the inside. Colony settlements raw and sprawling, at the very edge of what was survivable. He thought he'd gotten his sense of wonder reasonably calibrated. The Tari capital recalibrated it immediately. The city grew upward from the ground, the way a living thing grows, not assembled, but organic in its logic. Towers of translucent crystal spiraling between wide-open plazas of pale stone. Twin suns overhead sent their lights through those towers, at angles that produced shifting cascades of color across every surface, so the entire city seemed to breathe and shimmer, as though it was continuously aware of itself. The air carried a low harmonic resonance that Elias felt in his chest before his ears even registered it, and every Tari they passed stopped to look at him. Not hostile. Careful. The way you look at something you've only ever read descriptions of. When you finally encounter the real thing in person, with curiosity and the slight disorientation of discovering it doesn't quite match what you imagined. I feel like a museum exhibit, he muttered. You are the first human to walk here, Sarai said beside him. To them, you are an unknown quantity that creates curiosity and uncertainty. Reassuring? You have not yet given them reason to feel otherwise, she said. A pause. You will. The bonding trial was held the next morning. The Tari temple was enormous and almost perfectly silent, the kind of silence that has actual depth to it, that makes ordinary sound feel like an intrusion. Crystal columns lined the interior, each one lit from within by a soft, rhythmic glow. The floor was dark and polished to a mirror finish. At the center of the hall stood a circular platform encircled by currents of blue-white light that flowed like water in a gentle current. 7 elders in silver robes stood in a curved formation around the platform. Their eyes, reflective, ancient, completely unreadable, tracked Elias from the moment he stepped through the doors. The lead elder's voice carried through the entire space without appearing to be raised. Elias, Ward of Terra. Commander Sarai of the Tari Dominion, you stand before the circle of truth. If no genuine bond exists between you, the circle will recognize its absence and release you both. If a bond does exist, a pause, the circle will know that also. Elias swallowed. Understood. Come forward. They stepped into the ring of light together. The instant Elias crossed into the circle, the air around him changed. Heavier, charged, pressing in a way that had nothing to do with temperature or atmospheric pressure. He felt simultaneously weightless and completely fixed in place, like standing at the still center of something vast that was rotating steadily around him. Then the room disappeared. Not gradually. Not with any kind of transition. One breath he was standing in the temple. The next, he was standing in perfect, absolute darkness, suspended above nothing, surrounded by slowly drifting fragments of pale light that moved through the black like embers rising from a fire that wasn't there. Sarai stood beside him. What is this? His voice vanished into the dark the moment it left him. A constructed projection, she said, scanning the space with careful attention. The circle draws on our combined mental signatures and builds a shared environment from them. Whatever forms here originates from our genuine emotional states. It cannot be manipulated. So, this is literally our minds. A version of them. The drifting light fragments began pulling toward each other. Then the shapes arrived. They came from the far edges of the darkness, assembling themselves from shadow, four-legged, metallic, built along lines that announced their purpose without requiring any explanation. War machines. Their eyes burned red. Their movements were precise, mechanical, the clicking advance of things designed with exactly one purpose in mind. Elias stared. Are they supposed to be here? Sarai's composure fractured briefly. Just at the surface. No, she said. The ritual does not include drones. Something has been compromised. The machines began closing the distance. Elias had roughly 2 seconds before they reached them. He didn't spend either second deliberating. A shard of solid light had formed near his right hand, the way objects sometimes crystallize in dreams when you need them. Grabbed Italiano. It became a blade, pale and cold, roughly the length of a short sword. He had zero training with a sword. He also had zero time to care about that. We're fighting, he said. It wasn't a question. Sarai already had her weapon up, its energy charge building to an audible hum. We are fighting, she confirmed. What followed was not elegant. Elias was an engineer. His combat training consisted of a mandatory refresher course he'd taken 4 years ago and genuinely hadn't thought about since. But he was fast, and he understood how machines reasoned. He knew their patterns, their fixed logic, the specific points where an unpredictable input would force a pause in their processing. He used all of that. He came at them from angles their targeting systems hadn't indexed, threw shards of light into their sensor arrays to break their tracking, pulled their fire toward open space, while Sarai moved in behind them with surgical precision. She was extraordinary. Not a single movement that didn't connect with something, not a single strike that landed anywhere other than exactly where it needed to land. She fought like someone who had rehearsed every possible version of this moment in advance. And between them, without any planning or discussion, something clicked into place. He moved. She filled the space he'd just left. She committed. He covered the angle she'd exposed. When he stumbled, she was already positioned to give him the opening to recover. When a drone flanked her, he had already closed the gap. It worked with the smoothness of something long practiced, even though neither of them had practiced a single moment of it. The last drone shattered in a shower of white sparks and hit the dark floor in pieces. Elias dropped to one knee, breathing through his mouth, the light blade dissolving from his grip. For the record, he managed between breaths. When you said symbolic ritual, I pictured something with significantly less property damage. Sarai reached down and pulled him back upright. She was steadier than he was, but only just. The system was sabotaged, she said. What should have stayed symbolic was made real. A pause, but so was how you responded. The darkness lifted. They were standing in the temple again. Inside the glowing circle, the elders had lost their composure. Several were speaking rapidly to each other, their mirror-like eyes wide. The circle itself was brighter than before. Its steady pulse accelerated, beating with a rhythm that felt less like a machine and more like something alive. The lead elder spoke, and his voice had shifted less authority, more weight. The circle of truth has completed its assessment. A long pause. The bond between you is real. Elias turned toward him. That's weight. It was supposed to show there wasn't one. That was the entire point. The circle doesn't evaluate intention, the elder said. It evaluates truth. The truth it found was not absence of connection. Elias turned to Sarai. She was watching him with the same composed expression she always wore. But something underneath it had shifted, significant and quiet, like a change in barometric pressure just before a storm breaks. Perhaps, she said softly, the circle understands more than we do. That night, Elias stood at the viewport of his quarters, watching the twin moons climb above the city. Their light doubled everything below, laying 2 shadows beside every object on the pale stone streets. His door chimed. Sarai entered. She was wearing a plain robe instead of her uniform, and her hair was down, without the formal structure of her armor and rank. She looked different, still composed, still precise, but more genuinely herself. Less like a symbol, More like a person. You're still working through it, she said. Processing, he corrected. There's a distinction. She moved to stand beside him at the viewport. The council has reviewed the circle's result. They will honor it. The bond will be formally recognized. He looked at her. What do you think? Honestly. She was quiet long enough that he thought she decided not to answer. Then, I think the circle revealed something that was already there. It didn't create the connection. It found it. When you accepted at dinner, he said, you said it was because you thought I'd seen something in you worth honoring. Did you actually mean that? My people don't say things we don't mean. Right. He turned to face her fully. That's kind of exactly what I'm asking about. She looked at him, and the layer of composure was thinner than it had ever been, not absent, never absent, but transparent enough to see through clearly. When you spoke across that table and looked at me directly, she said, you weren't performing composure. You weren't selecting your words for effect. You simply said what you were thinking. A pause. In all the interactions I have had with humans, no one has ever done that. I caused the diplomatic incident, he said. You were honest with me, she said, even if you didn't know that was what you were doing. Elias looked out at the city for a moment. The light from the moons moved slowly across the crystal towers. For what it's worth, he said, I meant the word you. Even then, I didn't know your people's customs, but I looked at you across that table and I meant that specifically. He paused. I just didn't know it would matter. Her lips moved, not a full smile by any human measure, but the closest thing to one he had seen on her face since the moment they met. Perhaps that is exactly why the circle found what it found. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Elias had ever prepared for. Sarai became his guide through the city, through its unspoken codes and layered customs, its ancient history and the careful logic that governed everything from how meals were served to how arguments were resolved. He learned that the Tari's emotional control wasn't the absence of feeling, it was mastery of it, a civilization-wide practice of choosing how and when to express what was real. Because to them, expression carried weight, and weight demanded care. He also learned that Sarai specifically noticed everything. When he was frustrated before he said so, she adjusted without acknowledging it. When something caught his genuine interest, the architecture, the energy resonance of the city's infrastructure, the particular quality of light through the crystal towers at dusk, she stopped and let him look, without impatience. When he was lonely, which happened more than he'd expected, she appeared in the evenings and walked with him through quieter parts of the city, talking about things that had nothing to do with diplomatic timelines. He noticed things about her in return. The way her head tilt changed, depending on whether she was genuinely curious or simply listening, shorter, more immediate when it was real curiosity, more deliberate when it was professional. The particular precision of her opinions on Tari history, which were clearly at odds with official positions, but expressed with such measured care that you had to listen very closely to catch them. Her speed at spatial reasoning, which he discovered when she mapped an entire detour around a construction zone in her head before he'd finished reading the first warning sign. And the humor. Dry, exact, arriving without announcement and landing about one beat after you expected it to. He liked it more every single time. He was starting to like her more each time, not as a diplomatic reality or a cultural obligation. Actually, the attack came during a Tari astronomical celebration, a night event involving illuminated terraces and formal gatherings at the upper levels of the towers, the kind of occasion that turned the whole city luminous and drew delegations from every corner of the Dominion. Elias and Sarai were on one of those terraces at a senior official's banquet. The evening had actually achieved something resembling genuine warmth, a first, in his experience of Tari gatherings. The terrace shook. Not a tremor, a shaped, explosive charge, detonating against the far edge of the crystal wall with the kind of precision that announces immediately that it isn't accidental. Panels shattered outward, and the crowd broke in every direction at once. And out of the smoke and raining debris, drones emerged. The same model as before. The same red eyes, but entirely real, and entirely present. Stay close, Sarai said. Her weapon was already in her hand. They moved, without needing to discuss it. Elias had spent enough weeks beside her that it no longer required conversation. She handled the elevated positions. He read their movement logic and interrupted it. She cut toward the critical systems. He created the opening that let her reach them. A drone swung toward a cluster of tarry guests, and Elias put a section of broken railing through its targeting sensor array, giving Sarai the window she needed to shut it down permanently. The sounds were different from the ritual, harder, louder, the real weight of metal and energy in an actual physical space with actual consequences. The guests were screaming. Debris was still falling from above. They didn't stop. When the last drone collapsed and the alarm lights were still cycling red across the terrace, Elias stood in the wreckage with his pulse hammering, and Sarai stood beside him, already conducting a rapid assessment of the remaining guests. "Anyone badly hurt?" he asked. "Minor injuries only." She turned to him. "You? Fine." He checked himself. Scraped palms. Bruised shoulder. Nothing structural. "Who sent them?" "A faction within the Dominion," she said. "Those who believe this bond represents a corruption of what we are, rather than an expansion of it." A pause. "You were their primary target." He absorbed that. "They want to stop the bond from being recognized." "Yes. By removing me. Or by creating enough disorder to force the Council to reconsider the entire diplomatic framework." Elias looked at the scattered wreckage of the drones. 10? At Sarai. "That's not happening," he said. She studied him. "You seem very certain of that." "I am. I didn't travel 8 months to the edge of known space to let someone else's fear decide how this ends." She looked at him for a long moment, then gave one single, clean nod. "Neither did I." The Council convened the following morning. The extremist network had been partially mapped, beyond the terrorist attack. Intelligence indicated their next move was the city's central energy hub, a sabotage designed to trigger cascading grid failures, plunge the capital into full darkness and disorder, and place the blame publicly on the human delegation. The Council briefed them both. Sarai looked at Elias. Elias looked at the hub schematics spread across the table. "Energy infrastructure is what I do," he said. "If they've placed devices on the primary conduit lines, I can find them and pull them. I need access and a window." The lead elder said, "You would be walking directly into active danger." "Honestly," Elias said, "that's been true since the dinner party." They moved within the hour. The hub occupied a vast chamber at the heart of the city, a space where the scale of Tari engineering became genuinely impossible to ignore. Conduit lines running in disciplined parallel formations through halls that hummed with enough stored power to run a small planet. The extremists had already been inside. Elias could read it in the stutter of the status lights, the irregular cadence of the hum, the barely there smell of something that had been opened and touched without authorization. Sarai moved at his shoulder, weapon ready, eyes continuously scanning. "Primary device is on the intake conduit," he said, dropping to his knees beside the access panel. "Give me 90 seconds. "You have 60, she said. "We have movement." An extremist broke cover and sprinted for the central console. He made it approximately 4 steps before Sarai intercepted him. Elias heard 2 seconds of controlled motion, followed by the very definitive sound of someone being stopped. Then, silence. 60 seconds, she said, returning to position. "Working," he muttered. The first device came apart under his hands, then the second, then the third. Each one was built slightly differently from the last. Someone had actually put real thought into making them. Difficult to disarm, but the underlying logic was consistent across all of them, and Elias had spent years learning precisely how energy systems were vulnerable, and exactly why. He found the thread in each one, and followed it to the end. The last device went silent in his hands. The hub's hum settled back into its normal pattern, steady and deep, and reassuringly Done, he said. Sarai exhaled once. Quietly. "The secondary teams have been taken into custody by Council security. The operation is finished." Elias leaned back and stared at the ceiling of the hub for a long, quiet moment. "Good," he said. He paused. "Can I just sit here for a minute?" "Yes," she said, and she sat down beside him on the floor of the energy hub, the least dignified posture he had ever seen from her, and completely, entirely appropriate. Later that night, in the quiet of her chambers with the twin moons moving slowly overhead, they sat and watched the light shift across the crystal city below. "All of this," Elias said, from one comment at a dinner that was already going badly, All of this? Sarai said. From one moment of honesty in a room full of performance, the difference matters. He looked at her. Do you actually believe the circle got it right? I believe the circle found what I had already begun to understand, she said. I believe the attack failed tonight because of what we have built between us since that dinner. I believe that a careless sentence set in motion something that genuinely needed to happen, and that the universe occasionally arranges things in the correct sequence without asking permission first. That, he said, is the least logical thing you have ever said to me. Perhaps, she said, you are having an effect. He smiled. Is that a problem? She considered the question with her characteristic stillness. No, she said. It is a development I find I welcome. Outside, the crystal towers caught the moonlight and held it, transforming it into something that lingered, warm and slow and permanent against the dark. Below them, the city rested in a silence that was different from the silence of that first dinner. This one had depth. This one had survived something. Elias Ward had come to this mission imagining paperwork and handshakes and formal statements drafted by committee. He hadn't imagined the trial in the dark, or the drones on the terrace, or the floor of the energy hub, or a Tari commander who sat down beside him on that floor without being asked. He hadn't imagined Sarai. Whatever comes next, she said, we face it together. Together, he said. The moons climbed slowly overhead, their doubled lights softening everything below. And somewhere in a file on Terra, someone was already writing the incident report that would categorize the word misstatement as a minor cultural miscommunication, notable, resolved, no lasting damage. They would not be entirely right. What had actually happened was simpler than any incident report could ever capture. A man had said something honest without meaning to, and the honesty had found the one person in that room who recognized it for exactly what it was. The circle hadn't created anything. It had simply confirmed what was already real. 3 months later, the formal recognition ceremony was held in the Great Hall of the Tari Council. The room was nothing like the Argus dining hall. That one had been cold and perfect, and built from the materials of mutual suspicion dressed up as protocol. This one, crystalline, volte de starlight, moving through living glass panels in the ceiling, felt entirely different. Not warmer in temperature, warmer in the way rooms feel when the people inside them have finally stopped calculating. The human delegation filled the left gallery, the Tari officials filled the right, and for the first time in the recorded history of contact between their two peoples, neither side was actively avoiding looking at the other. They were watching Elias and Sarai walk to the center of the chamber, and the expression on their faces had no entry in any diplomatic vocabulary. It was simply hope. Elias had his dress uniform on. It fit well enough. Sarai walked beside him in ceremonial dress, a long garment that shifted between silver and deep blue as she moved, like watching light travel through water, and she carried herself exactly as she always had, except that Elias had spent enough time beside her now to see past the surface of it. Se was glad. She wouldn't have called it that, probably, but her eyes were bright, and her shoulders carried something forward in them, and the brief glance she sent his way, when she thought he wasn't looking, was the same glance she used for things she had decided genuinely mattered to her. He caught it. She knew he did. Neither of them said a word. Between them, that said everything. Roar gave a speech. It was the best one Elias had ever heard him deliver. Honest in a way his earlier speeches hadn't been. Direct in a way that only comes from having lived through something and made it out the other side, still standing. He talked about the dinner, about the misunderstanding, about the trial and the attack and the energy hub. He said Elias's name twice. Both times, his voice carried something that hadn't been anywhere in it the night they left Terra. Pride. The lead elder spoke after him. He addressed the circle of truth and what it had revealed. He addressed the extremist faction and what its failure had demonstrated, not merely as a security outcome, but as a statement about the direction of Tari culture. He said that his people had believed for many generations that logic and feeling were competing forces, that discipline and genuine connection could not occupy the same space, that to be moved was to be diminished. He said the events of recent months had shown that understanding to be incomplete. For a Tari elder of his standing, this was roughly the equivalent of a standing ovation from everyone who had ever lived. Elias sat very still and looked at his hands. Sarai leaned very slightly toward him, not touching, just near, and said, low enough for only him to hear. You are doing the thing where you pretend nothing is affecting you. I'm not pretending. Your hands are folded with too much precision, she said, and your jaw is doing what it does when you're processing something larger than you expected. He looked at her sideways. You've been cataloging me. I catalog everything I find worth understanding, she said simply. And I qualify. You are, she said, entirely unexpected, which is significantly more valuable than simply being interesting. In the gallery, someone started clapping, then more people joined, and the Tari added their deep resonant hum, and the sound built until Elias could feel it vibrating in his chest, two different forms of the same thing, blending in the air above the ceremony floor. After the formal session ended, they walked the upper terraces of the council building while the twin suns set. The city below warmed slowly toward amber, the crystal towers catching the light and giving it back softened and golden. Roar! Called you a hero, Sarai said. Roar is being generous. Roar is being precise, she said. There is a distinction. He leaned on the railing and looked out across the glowing city. I'm an engineer. I solve problems. Sometimes the problem turns out to matter more than I realized when I was walking into it. You are an engineer, she agreed, who ran toward every difficulty without being asked, who looked at the discomfort of another person and treated it as something worth addressing, who spent 3 months in a place nothing in his life had prepared him for, and instead of closing himself off, opened further. She paused. That is not engineering, that is courage. He looked at her. The setting suns were doing something extraordinary to the light around her, the silver of her skin catching the warmth and holding it, softening her at the edges. You weren't what I expected either, he said. When I read your briefing file, I thought you'd be completely unreachable. All precision and no person. And now I think you're one of the most genuine people I've ever met. And I've met a lot of people. She turned toward him fully. The light moved across her face, and she let it. When I accepted your words, she said, I didn't know what I was actually agreeing to. I knew the legal significance. I knew what the ceremony would require. But I didn't know what it would mean to actually build something alongside the person those words came from. And now, he asked. Now, she said, I am grateful for an imprecise human who could not tolerate an empty room. He laughed, sudden and completely real, and she watched it with the expression she wore when she was filing something away in the deepest part of herself. That might be the kindest thing anyone's ever said to me, he said. It will not be the last, she said. Below them, the city shone with warm light, full of people from 2 different worlds who were, for the first time, learning what it actually felt like to trust each other, not the calculated trust of carefully managed diplomacy, the kind that comes from going through something genuinely real and emerging from it still standing, side by side. Elias Ward, systems engineer and completely accidental bridge builder, stood on a crystal terrace under twin moons above an alien city and understood something clearly for the very first time. Some things are planned, some things are carefully prepared for, and some things simply arrive at a bad dinner when you're nervous and your mouth is running ahead of your judgment, and the universe sits back and watches to see what you'll actually do with it. He hadn't run, he'd meant the word you, even then, even before he understood why. The circle had always known, he was only now catching up. What comes next? He asked. Sarai looked out at the city. 3 outstanding agreements between our governments. Cultural exchange protocols to establish 47 unresolved technical questions in the infrastructure treaty requiring someone with detailed knowledge of energy systems. She glanced at him. I believe you are qualified. Of course there are 47 questions. 48, if you include the amendment that came in this morning. He shook his head, smiling. Where do we start? She turned to him with that full, clear, complete attention she gave only 2 things she had decided were genuinely worth it. The same place we always have, she said. Together, he said. Together. she confirmed. The twin moons rose above the horizon, climbing slowly above the towers, laying their doubled light across everything below. And somewhere in a terrafiling system, the war diplomatic incident was being formally closed out. Minor miscommunication, no lasting damage, resolved. The people writing that file had the facts right and the meaning completely wrong. What had actually happened was this. One human being, in a tense room at the wrong end of a long table, had gotten nervous and said the first honest thing in his head, and it had been exactly the right thing to say. Not because it was clever, not because it was planned. Because it was real. And real things, Ethernet out had a way of finding each other across tables, across species, across the kind of distances that make the very concept of connection seem entirely improbable. Elias Wards had offered something real without knowing he was doing it. The universe had known. And under the twin moons of the Tari homeworld, two people from worlds that had never expected to understand each other walked back inside, together, already talking, already building, already exactly where they were supposed to be. All because one man had refused to pretend the silence was comfortable. All because one woman had recognized honesty when she heard it. All because the smallest true things, it turns out, cast the longest shadows.